This is an exciting conference. I do appreciate Carol inviting me and allowing me to speak. The topic is blockchains in evolution, and I have been revising what I want to tell you constantly in the last couple of weeks. But let me really riff on the whole concept of evolution. At some point or other, a cell created itself and began replicating, right? And I can start from there. It seems like I've gone too far back. If I want to look at the blockchain, I might start with Alan Turing in the 1930s. How many of you have heard of Alan Turing? And since I can't see any of you, I'm going to assume everybody raised your hand. Alan Turing came up with this whole idea of computable numbers. And he had this thought machine that we later called a Turing machine. And some of y'all might have heard Turing referred to in the context of Ethereum. Anybody? A few hands? Being Turing complete means that some system can compute any particular number within some sort of reasonable limits. And that was what Turing said on computable numbers. I can get the word out, I really can. And computable numbers are, for all practical purposes, the result of computation. So when you watch a movie and you now see Spider-Man jump from building to building, and that was all built from computers, those results were really just computable numbers. It all comes back to Alan Turing and the idea that with the right program and the right inputs, you get a thing, and that thing's value might be your account balance at your bank, or it could be a great scene in a Spider-Man movie. And so all of computation sits on Alan Turing. Then we came to von Neumann, who figured out the architecture that we use in all of our computers, a storage device, a CPU, and some memory. And this continued on until, we actually started building these machines. And very early on, we came up with this idea of a hash. Raise your hand if you know what a hash is. All right, nearly universal. Well, a hash is basically a way to take some sort of data, get a little number, and check to see if that number is in a set. To begin with, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, we were just doing this so that you could rapidly see if this address was in your database before you actually went through the work of actually querying the database. You could create these hash tables, and they would give you a hint about what you were looking for. And so, but we didn't have the concept of a cryptographic hash. A cryptographic hash is one where the number that results from the hash function is really, really unique. If it's really, really unique, then it's proof of the data's existence. The original hashes that we used were maybe the first few letters of an address. If you have the first few letters of the address, then maybe that address is in your database. But anyone can create an address that matches the first few letters, so you can engineer against the hashes we originally used. Cryptographic hashes you can't engineer because the function is so unique that it's going to match with the data. This is really critical because this is the basis of the blockchain. This is the evolution. We've now reached a multicellular organism in the evolution of the blockchain when we had cryptographic hashes. Cryptographic hashes allowed cryptographic signatures, which meant that if you had a public key, you could sign something, a private key, you could sign something with a private key and verify it against a public key, the public key, private key verification. How many of you all understand public key, private key verification? My gosh, I get to skip most of what I've been thinking about. And so all this developed in the 90s. And in the 90s, there was a concept of hash cache, right, by, boy, his name just dropped out of my head. Some guy. And the idea was when you took an email, you had to look to see if they had done some work. And what his idea was is that anyone wanting to send an email would sit there and hash the email, change a number and hash it again, and change the number and hash it again. till you had enough zeros at the beginning of the hash to prove you did work. And then you could send the email. And with this hash cache, you could prove that someone spent at least a little bit of computing time to send an email to you. That meant you couldn't be spammed, because spammers rely on the idea that it's almost costless to send out millions of emails out. Now, this didn't catch on, but the idea was you could come up with a number that proves that some resources were behind building it. And then the seminal event was in 2009 when Satoshi Nakamoto, some anonymous guy, creates the whole proof of work scheme and figures out a way to distribute information uniquely and with ultra fidelity across everybody in the world without having to ask permission of anyone to participate in the system. You just can start mining and you can start building these blocks, and these blocks started getting distributed everywhere. Now, what is the real key here? The real key is that he figured out how to create immutable data that nobody can change. And he figured out how to distribute that data across the entire world. And he had one use case, and that's to keep score against some public-private key pairs, something we call a Bitcoin address, that holds a particular balance of Bitcoin. And when we want to transfer Bitcoin to somebody else, we write a transaction, we stick it into this immutable ledger, it gets distributed around the world, and suddenly, your dream is met. Somebody has sent you a Bitcoin. Okay? Now, the whole value proposition of Bitcoin is the idea that you can distribute transactions around the world and everybody can agree with them. The value is that there's an immutable ledger. And this is the next evolution of Bitcoin, is that with an immutable ledger, you can do some marvelous things. Like you can go and reform, product purchasing for HHS. All these sorts of things. You can create data in multiple systems, and you can put that data into a ledger and distribute it across everybody else, and then everybody else can benefit. And I don't know if we quite understand this yet. The idea that we have right now about identity is that an identity is constructed of these things. How many of you have some of these things? This is my wallet. It's got a lot of cards. It has health cards and credit cards, my backup business cards in case I forget my business cards, so you get one that's kind of ruffled around the edges because I've been carrying it around in my wallet. It has my key card to my room right now, right? This is my identity. But is this really my identity? This isn't my identity. These are basically passcodes into systems of record that exist around the world. Literally around the world. I go to systems run by the federal government to find my status as a citizen. I go to systems run by credit cards and banks for my bank balances, for my credit card balances. I go to systems, run by healthcare companies about my statuses with insurance. And I'm playing some multi-user, web games, and who knows where those servers are, probably out of China. Right? And anyone who can win a trivia contest is me. Right? These are the keys to the trivia contest. If somebody gets my driver's license number, gets my social security number, gets my this, and they can answer certain questions, they are now me. In other words, my identity does not exist. It's a bunch of attestations scattered in all of these different systems of record. And if you go and apply for a loan, and you tell them that you have no debts, they believe you, right? No, they go ask a credit reporting agency and go dig through those records. Now, are those records always exactly right? No, because all the people that won the trivia contest and did things in my name have stuff in my credit report record too. I could never get a cell phone from a particular company because apparently I, in Las Vegas, bought a cell phone back in the 90s and ran it for 3 months and it never paid my bill. All right, and I immediately reported it and everything, and it got off all my credit ratings, but they still wouldn't give me the cell phone. All right, so you know the idea of the blockchain is to create a place where I can actually have an identity, where I can create a series of records in a blockchain that are potentially recognizable worldwide. They may only be linked to other systems that actually have done verification and validation. In other words, let's say there's a company like Identity Mine who does KYC, AML processing for people. And if they go to my cryptographic identity, they can find a token that they can send to Identity Mine. As long as it's accompanied with a signed token from me, they'll say, okay, yeah, I'll answer identity questions about this guy, and then they can go and answer those questions. But think about it. If I've given a company requesting credit, you know, I want to open up a credit card, I filled out all this information, I said, oh, by the way, this is my cryptographic identity, and Identity Mine can verify it. They go to Identity Mine and they go, no, that isn't signed properly, you didn't get a digital token from Paul, then I've effectively put a password on my social security number because I have an identity that Identity Mine recognizes as the place to go. And they don't even have to talk to me. They just verify it on the blockchain because the blockchain has already distributed the data needed for verification to all these systems. Now, does this scale though? Because if everybody in the world needs an identity, then how in the world can that all fit on top of a blockchain? And the answer, of course, is complex. The answer is that it can scale. And the primary architectural component of the blockchain that existed in Satoshi Nakamoto's architecture from the very beginning was the Merkle tree. Everybody that understands Merkle trees, raise your hand. Ah, not as many hands. Okay. Here is the trick. All of you guys that understood hashes, that there's a function that creates a unique identifier for any particular piece of data, you should recognize that you can take 2 hashes and run it through that hash function and get yet another unique hash that combines the 2 inputs. Now, envision the ideal sports bracket. Now, the ideal sports bracket, I'm from Louisiana, the ideal sports bracket is an American football tournament tree that results in the only legitimate Super Bowl in history where the New Orleans Saints won. How many of you guys know who the New Orleans Saints played last night? How many of you? Anybody? Well, who they play? Who dat? I'm a Saints fan. I don't know any other team. And so the idea of the Merkle tree is to answer a question: how did the Saints make it to the Super Bowl without ever having to care about who they played or anything about who they played? I can go to the sports bracket and look at the first game the Saints played, the second game they played, the third game they played, the fourth game they played, the fifth game they played, finally when they recognized that they were really going to the Super Bowl and whoever they played, and they won. And that's the key of a Merkle tree, is to create a whole lot of data where you only have to look at where it's combined to find a final proof that proves your data was there. So when you go to a Merkle tree-based blockchain that's global, and it can identify anyone in the world, and you only need a handful of hashes to prove that the data is correct. You've created a scalable means to solve a lot of the identity problems in the world. Now, I'm over by 18 seconds. The blockchain, I'm going to say this, the blockchain is the technology that's really going to revolutionize the world. It's going to provide a platform for integrity and for proper transactions between parties, and it's really going to save the world from a lot of the path that technology has been taking us to date. So thank you very much.